now like to introduce our brilliant speakers. Grace Blakeley is an economics commentator and staff writer at Tribune Magazine. She is the author of Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization, which you can get from Repeater's website. She is also the author of the forthcoming book, The Corona Crash: How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism. Chris Saltmarsh is a co-founder of Labour for a Green New Deal. Chris has worked with student activist network People and Planet, managing their fossil fuel divestment campaign at UK universities. He has written for Tribune, Novara, and Jacobin Magazine. Chris and Grace, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So, to kick off the discussion, I wondered if both of you could provide an overview of the concept of a Green New Deal, how it seeks to address the dual crises of climate change and social inequality, and its historical roots in FDR's New Deal of the 1930s.
So yeah, the idea of the Green New Deal, obviously, as you were just hearing, is obviously based on FDR's New Deal, which took place just before the Second World War, and was aimed at being a kind of, classic Keynesian stimulus program, which was kind of supposed to be dealing with the impact of the Great Depression by increasing government spending in order to boost aggregate demand of the economy over the long run. Now, there's some disagreement over how much that program was actually worth, but recent estimates suggest that the New Deal was worth around 30% of US GDP at the time. Now, that's really quite significant. But actually, there are also, looking back on the economic history of the time, a lot of economists also argue that it wasn't the New Deal itself that actually shifted the US out of the Great Depression, which is obviously a very deep and severe depression. It was the mobilization of resources that took place during the Second World War. So it's this idea of a kind of mass mobilization of society's resources to tackle an external threat, which is often used to kind of illustrate the ideas behind the Green New Deal. So on the one hand, you have the New Deal itself, which is aimed at dealing with the impact of the Great Depression. Then you have the Second World War, which was aimed at obviously preparing society, not just the US, but also various other societies for the conflict that would last for the next several years. And actually, I was listening the other day to a podcast where Andreas Malm, who's written a lot about climate breakdown, was actually saying that perhaps the best example of this mass mobilization of resources about which we're talking when we talk about the Green New Deal is war communism in Russia. So this was again the Russian government's attempt to kind of prepare or deal with the impact of the war, and also the kind of civil war that took place within Russia afterwards. And that was again obviously aimed at dealing with an external threat that was much more kind of communitarian in nature. Now obviously there are a whole load of problems to do with war communism, and Russia was a very, very poor country at the time. But what's interesting about that is that that was a period where Russia was able to run its economy without any fossil fuels whatsoever. Now this was obviously because the parts of the country that where the fossil fuels were located were cut off from the government during the Civil War. But Malm says that this is again a good example of a mobilization of society's resources to tackle a problem. But in this context, rather than the Second World War, which involves a massive ramping up of use of fossil fuels, this was an example of actually the complete decarbonization, effectively, or the removal of coal entirely from the economy at the time. So through all of these examples, you can see what is meant by this idea of the Green New Deal. It is, we have a target, we have a mission, we have a goal, whether that's, fight a war, which, is obviously not the kind of goal that we would want to have at the moment, or decarbonize by, say, 2050. And it's about orientating all areas of public policy, all areas of economic activity towards that goal. And that obviously means much greater levels of centralized planning, perhaps, decentralized planning, rather than simply allowing economic activity to be governed by the market mechanism. And that's something I guess we can talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, and I guess to pick up on how the kind of Green New Deal has really exploded into all of our consciousnesses and and politics over the past kind of couple of years now. For me, I think it's really interesting to think about how the Green New Deal is maybe understood slightly differently by different kind of groups of people in different contexts, and that's a good way of understanding kind of certainly, you know, where at Labour for a Green New Deal, where we're coming from. And so, you know, I'm sure everyone kind of knows the story of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being elected to Congress in the US, and, you know, one of the first things that she did was, you know, take a stand with the Sunrise Movement, kind of young people who occupied Nancy Pelosi's office. That was before she was even sworn in, and they were calling for a Green New Deal. They were calling for green jobs. So yeah, and, you know, in that context, you know, what they were calling for was a 10-year mobilization, as Grace said, of just the entire economy's resources towards this this kind of dual goal of decarbonizing, of tackling the climate crisis, but also tackling the kind of inequality crisis, the crises of economic injustice that we're seeing. And I think what the Green New Deal does really nicely is encapsulate this kind of approach to the climate crisis and those other crises. But I think a lot of like climate and environmental movements haven't been able to quite do over the past couple of decades. And that's really understand the kind of the foundational link between climate injustice and other kind of economic injustices, as you know. And for me, that's being kind of foundationally rooted in capitalism and the kind of the crises that it's producing. But, you know, I think again, the kind of the details of a Green New Deal, you know, depending on who you ask, might be a little bit different. And so I think really the kind of, you know, what they were putting forward in the US, this is a kind of, you know, what you might call, I guess, a radical Keynesianism. And, you know, when, you know, if you read Ann Pettifor's book on the Green New Deal, which I'd certainly recommend, you know, that really focuses on kind of reform to the international monetary system and how that can kind of really kind of, yeah, be the foundation for that massive spending. And I think, you know, really the contribution that I think we made with Labour for a Green New Deal was, I think, to bring the idea of the Green New Deal into a kind of more explicitly kind of socialist like world almost. And I think the arguments that we like to make is that, you know, if what we're saying is capitalism, markets, the profit motive being spread for our economy is really the foundation, you know, not just for the persistence of a fossil fuel industry that's kind of driving us into chaos, but also the poverty we see, the inequality we see, then, you know, we need explicitly kind of socialist responses to that. And so, you know, for us, the Green New Deal is about spending, it's about investment, it's about regulation, but it's about using those things in a kind of transformational way. So we want to see that the economy is being transformed really from its base. So I think, you know, one of the things that we've really been pushing, and I think one of the more unique things I think we've brought to the debate, is the real need for kind of public ownership and expanding public ownership as being absolutely central to a kind of a Green New Deal that's going to face up to really the scale of the crises. So obviously, you know, that bringing the energy sector into public ownership is a massive deal because the because the energy sector, when left to the profit motive, has allowed the fossil fuel industry not just to maintain but to expand. Like the fossil fuel industry is literally currently expanding. In the decade it needs to be contracted, but also other elements of the economy, like whether it's housing, whether it's agriculture, whether it's, you know, services, whether it's manufacturing. These are all like, and finance. These are all massively important areas of the economy that could contribute to that decarbonisation, to that Green New Deal effort, but currently aren't. And I think our analysis, my analysis, is that that's because, again, their primary logic by which they operate is to make profit, is to maximize profits for capital, not to work in the kind of broader social interest, the interest of climate justice. So by expanding public ownership across the economy, both, you know, from energy and beyond, you kind of you give yourself as a society, as an economy, the possibility of managing a transition, of managing a kind of Green New Deal, of managing all of these sectors contributing to this big goal. That's not to say necessarily that publicly owned economies or industries will go to, you know, will be moving towards climate justice. Obviously, you know, you require a socialist government, you require grassroots movements, you know, militant trade unions to really like make sure that, you know, the publicly owned industries that we do have are being used, are being managed in that way. But I think, yeah, I just wanted to add that as I think a really key element of a Green New Deal that I think is kind of worth the hype, if you like.
One of the criticisms of the Green New Deal and also Keynesianism, I guess, historically, has been that it prioritises the economies of the global north. So it's a big question, but how would we get a global Green New Deal?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and it's a very important question. And actually, the place that I would go to for a really in-depth discussion about what this might look like is UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, in 2018 released a very long report called Financing the Global Green New Deal, which is basically about how you extend the Green New Deal to the international level. Now, there are a lot of different considerations that we need to be thinking about here, because firstly, there is the question of how do you facilitate the same mobilization of resources in places in the global south where they're more reliant on international bond markets to be able to borrow in order to undertake that investment, and where, you know, at the moment you're seeing capital flee those states as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. So there's the issue of kind of mobilizing resources. Secondly, there's the issue of international institutions and international norms and rules. So obviously, you know, countries in the global south are losing a lot of money to capital flight. They are far less responsible, obviously, for climate breakdown, but end up, you know, often having a lot of carbon intensive production offshore to them, and obviously, you know, they're dealing with the consequences much more deeply, and those disproportionate impacts and the disproportionate effects of international norms, rules, and institutions aren't really dealt with by existing, you know, international institutions, even those that are aimed at kind of reducing international inequality. And then there's the issue of resources. So obviously, a lot of the kind of rare earth metals that go into solar panels, that go into electric vehicles, etc., come from the global south, and they are often produced according to a logic of extractivism that it kind of impoverishes nations in the global south and can accelerate environmental degradation in those countries. So yeah, there's, you know, on the first question, obviously the question of resources. This is kind of why Anne Pettifer talks a lot in her book about the need for an international currency, because currently, obviously, places like the US and to a lesser extent the UK are basically able to borrow as much as they want on international bond markets. They're able to issue bonds kind of ad infinitum, and they're able to kind of print their own currency as well to create new money, basically because there's kind of a lot of trust in the stability of the US and UK and to a lesser extent certain European economies, which makes it cheap for them to borrow, and it means that they can create money without it catalyzing significant amounts of inflation. The issue for global south countries is that it's harder for them to borrow internationally. Often they face higher interest rates. They also their kind of monetary policy is much more constrained. Often they have to borrow in foreign currency rather than borrowing in their own currency, which means that they can be very affected by kind of exchange rate fluctuations. Now, this idea of having an international currency would deal with a lot of those problems, because you wouldn't have those problems around, you know, countries being less able to borrow in their own currency, being less able to kind of control their own policies around fiscal and monetary policy. So the idea is basically to create a kind of international currency or an international reserve currency that sits on top of all the other existing national currencies. And there's a kind of a sort of model for this in the IMF model of special drawing rights, which is basically a kind of a semi-currency created by the IMF that is distributed to different countries based on a kind of quota system, and that allows them to then exchange those SDRs for hard currency when they need to. But unfortunately, the system is much too small at the moment to really be having an impact on many states in the global south and to allow them to kind of marshal the resources they need, not just to fight climate breakdown, but to fight the pandemic as well. So there's a question there about how you undertake those resource transfers. So firstly, you're going to need to do some transfer of resources to the global south and transfers of technology as well. That kind of comes into international laws and institutions, because there's a lot of restrictive intellectual property rules that prevent global south countries from being able to use technologies that would help them fight climate breakdown. So there's technology, there's just resources. So obviously there's going to need to be some resource transfers to support these states to be able to generate the resources that they need to fight climate breakdown. And then there's this question of international currency. So kind of dealing with the fact that, you know, very powerful countries are able to generate huge resources, are able to borrow lots on international markets because of their kind of basically imperial status within the world economy, and that isn't the case for the global south. So there's dealing with all of those issues, and I think, you know, UNCTAD puts forward some interesting proposals there. So the expansion of IMF special drawing rights, the creation of international climate banks, for example, that would lend to these countries, and obviously just over technology and resource transfers. Then there are these questions of international institutions. Firstly, you know, we need to be thinking about reforms to international lending by the IMF, by the World Bank, because currently a lot of states that are really on the kind of sharp end of climate breakdown aren't able to get the resources they need to fight it. So, for example, Mia Mottley, who's the president of Barbados, has talked a lot about how island nations are really kind of being shafted by international institutions that aren't giving them the money they need to fight this issue that they didn't cause, but they're really being harmed by. There's also issues around, as I said, intellectual property. Do global south states have access to the technology that they need to fight climate breakdown? There's issues around tax avoidance and capital flight. So all these countries have kind of been encouraged to kind of open up their economies to international capital, and what that's often meant is that they're experiencing significant amounts of capital flight, often via tax havens, which is again undermining their capacity to deal with these issues. So those, amongst various other, you know, problems, not least the fact that global south countries have a far weaker voice in most international institutions than the more powerful ones. All of those ones need to be addressed as well, and that needs to be clearly part of a global Green New Deal. And then finally, there's this much more thorny question of resources. So, you know, if we were to kind of completely transform our transport system so that everyone has an electric car, that's going to create a huge toll on states in the global south, unless we suddenly manage to be able to kind of start mining asteroids or whatever, and then you get into a whole series of other questions about what that means for the environment. So yeah, there's also that question of resources, and actually thinking about, do we need to change the way we live, rather than just thinking let's do exactly what we're doing now but just decarbonize. So that means potentially much more kind of public use of public transport, kind of a move towards much more kind of collectivized activities and behaviors, because that's generally more efficient and uses fewer resources. So yes, that's on public transport. Potentially, you know, when we're thinking about energy systems, the decisions that we're making about what kind of changes we want to undertake, are we using wind, are we using solar, again, must be informed by those decisions about where those resources are going to be coming from. So I think those three areas are all really important considerations, and they're not, to a certain extent, the coronavirus pandemic is bringing those first two issues to the front and center of the conversation, because basically it's showing that we need a massive debt write-off for states in the global south if they're going to be able to deal with the pandemic and if they're going to be able to deal with climate breakdown. Now, that is really the first battle I think we have to be undertaking, because obviously, you know, there's going to be a massive increase in debt distress and deaths if states in the global south can't get access to currency, basically to foreign currency during this pandemic. And they'll be therefore on a much worse foot to try and do the investment they would need to do to fight climate breakdown. So dealing with that debt crisis is, I think, the first thing that we have to deal with. And then over the longer term, we really need to think about deep reform to international institutions that govern the global economy.
Yeah, I think all of that's like absolutely spot on. I think what I just add is like one of the frames, or one of the things that we kind of brought when we kind of started Labour for Green New Deal, when we started initially putting things out there, was like, yeah, this idea of like reparations, like in this context. And I think, you know, often we think of reparations in like a monetary sense, and I think in some ways, like, monetary reparations are going to be need to be a massive part of rebalancing the power imbalances that have been very intentionally created globally. And, you know, debt write-offs, I think, are a good start. But I think on you know, as well as that, you know, I think there needs to be a recognition that in terms of like what's already been stolen and destroyed by kind of decades of colonialism, the imposition of capitalism, and now climate impacts, like, there's not enough money in the world to pay for that, and there's not enough money in the world to pay for the transformations that need to happen. So yeah, so we also need to be conceiving of reparations as transformational. I think that really kind of feeds into what Grace was describing. And just kind of on the question of international institutions, I think one that an international institution that often gets off the hook, or it is the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so this is essentially the body that convenes, coordinates the kind of COP processes, those kind of UN summits that happen every year that produce the Paris Agreement. And this is essentially a kind of a body that is like massively dominated by capitalist states, by global north states, like Grace described how that's the case with basically every international institution. But to the extent that the kind of botched agreement in Copenhagen in when was it? Testing my memory. It must have been about 2009. That was essentially written in a back room by, convened by Denmark with like the most powerful states, and it was a total it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. They totally kind of contravened the official process of the convention, and then they put it to the conference for approval, which actually didn't. It wasn't even approved, quite rightly, not by consensus. And so that's like an example of how, in a very kind of obvious, egregious sense, that system is kind of ridden over by the most powerful countries that participate in it. But the convention itself, or the framework itself, like, it is essentially set up to just churn out free trade agreements under the guise of climate action. And we've essentially defaulted into the Paris Agreement being the benchmark for what we must achieve. 1.5 being the thing that everything is held to. But the Paris Agreement is predicated on nationally determined contributions. That's what they call it. So for the first time at Paris, rather than having kind of top-down determined emissions reductions contributions, the idea was that countries could come up with them themselves. They could volunteer what they thought they could achieve. But actually, if you add all of these contributions together, that would only limit average temperature rises to about 3.2 degrees in a best case scenario. And they're not even legally binding. So, if by some miracle, all of the countries did what they say they were going to do, we'd still, face runaway climate change. And this is essentially the establishment, the status quo, and relatively unscrutinized, certainly in the kind of mainstream international institution that is supposed to mediate kind of global climate action, but actually it acts to reproduce, the capitalist system that is producing, the climate crisis. And so, we need to totally reorganize how that all works. And then I think the last thing I'd say on this is kind of riffing off what Grace was saying as well, we need to think about how as well as the kind of material resources that countries in the global south have, we need to think about like what context and what system they're operating within. And so you can think of examples of countries like Venezuela that are run by socialists and are revolutions in motion, but at the same time they're what you might describe as petro-states. Their economy is entirely dependent on oil. And there are other countries that you could point to as well that are less explicitly leftist or socialist in terms of who's running them. But ultimately there's a lot of countries that are locked into economies based on extracting and burning fossil fuels because as Grace described, their economies have been hollowed out for Western corporations to come in and profit from. And ultimately, like, fossil capital is an incredibly dominant and profitable form of capital. And when we're talking about whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Gulf states, actually the choice often isn't fossil fuels or renewables. It's fossil fuels or a much less developed, if you want to use that language, economy. So we also I think I still haven't quite decided whether I like the frame of global Green New Deal. I've often talked in terms of internationalist Green New Deal, because certainly from my perspective, I'm thinking about what's a Green New Deal going to look like from the UK. That's where I'm kind of operating, organizing. We need to be making sure the measures, the transformations that we're enacting, they're not just within the borders of our nation state. They're looking to kind of undermine, contradict those kind of imperial colonial legacies, and so that from our kind of position of power that we have unjustly in this country kind of accrued over time, we can begin to undermine the systems that we've created and begin to transform the economy so that those countries, those peoples who currently are basically have no choice but to kind of passively contribute to the the climate crisis by extracting their oil reserves, so that they actually get a choice of like, what do they want their economic, their industrial futures to be.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So another idea that's gained considerable attention in recent years is degrowth, particularly in the context of the global north. How does the Green New Deal relate to arguments around degrowth?
Yeah, I think the Green New Deal, whilst, you know, people who advocate degrowth and those who advocate the Green New Deal often arrive at fairly similar conclusions, I think the narrative and the frames that they use are quite different, because often this idea of degrowth conjures up images that the environmentalist movement has been kind of saddled with, sometimes legitimately, sometimes not, for quite a while, which is that, you know, it wants us all to go back to wearing kind of, you know, straw bags and like foraging for food and, you know, whatever, which is obviously not what a lot of degrowth people think. But the whole idea of saying, you know, we have growth now, and everyone basically believes that growth is what is responsible for rising living standards, even if that's not true. So taking that and then just inverting it rather than critically challenging the concept, even if that isn't actually what a lot of degrowth people do, because the more sophisticated versions are about, you know, challenging what we mean by GDP and coming up with alternative measures. Often it is interpreted as, this thing means, you know, rising living standards, they want us to have the opposite of that. So from a kind of narrative perspective, I think that you know, the whole degrowth frame is not what we need in order to build mass support for eco-socialism, which is obviously what we're trying to do. The only way of pushing back against the kind of marketized agenda that is being pushed by various international institutions and economists and policymakers, which is just, you know, impose a carbon tax, is to actually have a popular movement that says, no, we need something very, very different. And, you know, when you're combining that with, as Chris said, a very strong case for democratic public ownership, with, you know, proposals around investment and jobs creation, which is, you know, even easier to make in the case of the Green New Deal than it is for a typical stimulus program, because green jobs, you know, investment in green technology can create 3 times as many jobs as just kind of standard dirty investment. So combining all those things together and actually trying to articulate a vision for a more prosperous, a more equal and a more sustainable society is, I just think, much smarter than saying, you know, degrowth, which people kind of understand as, we need to stop consuming, we need to stop getting better off. Now, obviously, having said that, you know, if we're going to be thinking about how we're measuring that increasing prosperity, then we cannot use GDP as a metric, because not only does it not account for a lot of the things that we would want to account for, things like inequality, you know, things like, you know, health outcomes, education outcomes, whatever. It also accounts for a lot of things that we don't want it to account for. So it accounts for economic activity that may kind of, you know, increase output, but which is ultimately harming the environment. It could include economic activity that is actually creating huge instability that will lead up to a crisis, as it did in the massive increase in GDP that preceded the financial crisis. So coming up with a different measure, or maybe a different set of measures, which I think probably is where we would all land on, is really important for measuring the progress of the Green New Deal. But I think that has to be done as part of the development of a Green New Deal, the framing of which is, this is about making everyone better off. It's actually about improving our living standards. It's about making us kind of happier, more equal. Currently, most of our resources are monopolized by a tiny elite at the very top of society, including fossil fuel executives who are actually being subsidized by the public purse to continue, you know, basically wrecking the planet. If we had a more rational and just system, everyone would be better off, even if GDP wasn't continuously rising. And yeah, that obviously means coming up with different metrics, but I think that should be part of the development of a Green New Deal, because obviously, you know, you're deciding the outcome that you want to get to. So, you know, that could conceivably be different in different parts of the world. But I imagine, you know, here we will be thinking about, yes, decarbonizing by 2030, but also creating jobs, creating X amount of jobs, reducing inequality, trying to reach X amount of public ownership. And then you would be able to build measures of success on the back of that. So I think the kind of measures that we're using to decide whether or not this is working have to be dependent upon the targets that we set ourselves. And I think this kind of growth versus degrowth, GDP going up versus GDP going down debate doesn't really capture the complexity of what we're trying to describe.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. Like, I think what I would say is, if anyone is interested in degrowth, like the people that I'd recommend reading off the top of my head would be Georges Callis and Jason Hickel. Like, they're sophisticated anti-capitalist degrowthers who I think have made very valuable contributions. What I would say is, I think degrowth as a field, and it's a theoretical field, it's not, I think Grace is right to say that it's not a campaign or a movement in the way that the Green New Deal is, and I think it's a valuable theoretical field to engage with, but it isn't consistent. It doesn't really have a consistent line on capitalism, and I think that's where as a field it maybe falls down. And so, you know, Callis and Hickel are certainly on the anti-capitalist side of it, and they make excellent contributions, and so does everyone across the field. But I think for me the issue is one of emphasis. For me, the issue that we're dealing with in relation to the climate crisis, economic crises, etc., isn't growth per se. For me, it's this kind of imperative of capital accumulation being the primary motive in the economy, of profit being the kind of primary motive for all kind of economic activity, and that driving the climate crisis, that driving inequality, and all of these other side effects. And growth is one of those side effects. But at the same time, you know, I think if we're getting sucked into the degrowth frame, like what we might, you know, threaten ourselves with is, the Green New Deal over the short term will necessarily require economic growth, because we're going to be investing a whole load in a load of economic activity. And, my perspective would be, once that's kind of done, once we've kind of done a lot of the transformations in the kind of short time frame that we have, then sure, the kind of economic, growth by GDP or whatever measurement will probably plateau, and you probably want to get to a stage of your economy where it can, grow. The economy can grow when it needs to, but also it can shrink when it needs to. And I think we've seen with the pandemic that there will be some situations where the economy does have to contract. But I think the climate crisis is also a very strong case where in a very short period of time we will have to see economic activity or productivity certainly kind of expand quite rapidly. So yeah, I agree with Grace that the frame of degrowth isn't necessarily the most helpful, but there's lots you can learn from that kind of theory and that literature.
Leading on from that, how does the Green New Deal go beyond moral and behavioural arguments that place the onus on individuals to change their consumption habits, instead proposing a larger scale transformation for collective life? I mean, Grace, you already talked about it a bit, but I was just going to push it a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think this is really important because, and this actually cuts to the core of this kind of debate that we're having, because it would be very convenient for the big oil companies, the big polluters, if the whole discussion around climate change focused on individual behaviour and the idea that, it's up to each of us as individuals to stop consuming X or Y or Z. And the focus being on individual consumption rather than the collective structures of our society. Because obviously, if it's like, are you using plastic straws? Are you, do you have a phone that has rare earth metals in it? Do you have a car? Like all of these things, then you are not going to be able to build a mass movement. And also you are pushing the onus, the responsibility for what is going on from the people who are profiting from the climate crisis onto people who are basically predominantly trying to survive in an economy that is basically hostile to their existence. So someone who has to drive X miles to get to their job every day that pays them minimum wage and then comes home and doesn't really think about, the consumption choices that they're making is not and should not be the number one enemy of the climate movement. That would be completely and utterly mad. And I think, again, that is another problem perhaps environmentalism has suffered with, is that it often comes across as though environmentalists can be kind of lecturing working people about what they should and shouldn't be doing, right? So I think that kind of moralistic framework is just a really bad way of building support for eco-socialism. And yeah, obviously it benefits the big fossil fuel companies if we're thinking, well, it's all up to us to stop using plastic straws and recycle and, try and take public transport every now and again. Because not only is the sum of those choices not going to be enough to deal with climate breakdown, it's also not going to be enough to actually change the structures of the economy in order to shift it away from the dependence on fossil fuels. You know, the vast majority of which takes place in production, and often actually production that countries in the global north have offshored to parts of the global south. We like to think of ourselves as a kind of immaterial service-based economy, but that's only because we've offshored production to like large other parts of the world. And actually, as we've seen during the pandemic, a lot of the kind of appalling working conditions that we used to see only in other parts of the world are actually taking place here as well. So, you know, just reshoring production doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have a just and sustainable economic model. So yeah, I mean, the conversation that we need to be having needs to be about changing the foundations of the economy. So, you know, the basic fundamental infrastructure upon which everything else depends. That is the transport system, communication system, energy systems, and you know what they depend on. And now, obviously, at the moment, most of the world depends on fossil fuels in one form or another for most of those things. And so, yeah, there's a question there about, you know, kind of completely transforming all of those fundamental structures, but also along with that, thinking about how we can change the way that society works as well. So if we're thinking about shifting the foundations of our transport system away from fossil fuels, we also need to think about, alongside that, away from kind of individualized modes of transport to collective modes of transport as well. And obviously, you know, the question then arises, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to deal with this? Now, we could talk for a very, very long time about the how are you going to pay for it question. But I think, you know, a lot of people would agree, regardless of your view on taxation and spending, that taxing the fossil fuel companies to compensate for the damage that they've caused over the last 80 years. During that time, they've known about climate change. There's evidence to suggest that they've known about climate change since the 1960s, and have put a lot of that money into funding denialism, climate denialism. How do we make the fossil fuel companies pay for the damage that they've caused and to support the transition? And more broadly, you know, how are we making sure that the people who are disproportionately responsible for climate breakdown, that is the top 10% of the world's population, and even in, you know, in rich countries like the UK, it's still the top 20-30% of people who are taking multiple flights a year, flying all around the world for work, and using a lot more resources than everyone else. It's really those people that we should be focusing on to kind of provide some of the resources that will allow us to shift the kind of foundations of our society, rather than trying to kind of nudge behavioral change through legislation or kind of advertising or whatever, which obviously isn't going to work. And also, rather than saying, let's impose a climate tax, which is again very individualized, because it's going to impose all the costs of the transition on the people with the fewest resources, because they're the ones going to be spending the most money on these things. And so, yeah, I mean, basically the argument has to be, we need to be focusing on climate breakdown as a collective issue, and one that can only really have a collective response. And therefore we need to think, again, I think this comes back to the last question, we need to think very clearly and be very responsible about the language that we're using, and make sure that that language is deliberately being used to evoke a sense of solidarity in the fight against climate breakdown, rather than kind of focusing on individual behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I wanted to just quickly focus in on like food as a particular focus on this, because I think it's a really interesting example. And often when I've spoken on panels and things at events over the years, there'll always be at least one question of someone asking, you know, what about food? You know, you've not spoken about food. And I think it's, you know, it's often a useful point. I think often we don't talk about food and agriculture because it can be a sticky question that actually, coming from our perspective, we've not really thought through very often. And so there's obviously a very well developed movement, I think you probably could call it a movement, around like veganism and vegetarianism, and that kind of that movement can tend towards a real militancy, which is obviously, you know, well documented and satirized very often. And you know, I was a vegan for about 4 years, and I started off being, you know, making that choice for environmental reasons, and then I kind of became like animal rights reasons, and then it kind of became health reasons, and then I packed it in as I kind of developed, I guess, this more kind of like structural politics. But I think it is like an interesting example, because how like into such like almost supernova like the vegan trend has become, with very little, like, I think, mainstream like political organizing behind it. Like I think it is important to like recognize that to a big extent there's a lot of capital behind it, and I think, you know, there's obviously, you know, as companies develop like these kind of options and vegan products, like, you know, it's very heavily advertised, but you know, it's not like there's been a massively well organized political movement behind what has been actually quite a significant like culture of behavior change over the past couple of decades. I think it is important, on the capital point, it is important to say, like, you know, one of my big critiques is that, you know, however many people you have going vegan, making those changes, very often what you're seeing is the creation of new markets for capital to exploit, not necessarily the contraction of the old one. So we're not necessarily seeing a decline in industrial agriculture. Actually, we're seeing an increase as that's kind of exported around the world. And so, you know, but you know, at the same time, I think it's interesting to interrogate, like, why has this trend happened on such a scale? And actually, maybe it's wrong to call it a trend. It's more of a shift in how people do like eat and how they do relate to food. And I think, you know, it's important because there can be a lot of hopelessness around, you know, the climate crisis. And if you really pin me down on it, I think I would say I'm a pessimist in relation to it. I think the Green New Deal is the best chance that we have, and it's done wonders, I think, for my mental health, many people's mental health, having it around as a political idea over the past couple of years. But, you know, we are in a very difficult situation. It's very difficult, you know, when we see these kind of climate impacts around us, whether it's wildfires, hurricanes. It's hard to know what to do in the face of this existential crisis, which, like, yeah, as we've described, is contingent on whether we transform our entire economic system or not. And so actually people's food, what they eat, how they travel, I think, you know, it's obviously promoted, as Grace says, and she's absolutely right, by fossil capital, by other fractions of capital, because it's in their interest for people to not challenge their dominance. But I think also people maybe more intuitively move towards it because it's a way they feel like they can exert control over this incredibly like abstracted and incredibly large existential crisis. But I think, you know, and this is my experience, and it's the experience for a lot of people that I know, that kind of control that you might exert over your diet or your other behaviors, that can placate those feelings of hopelessness for a bit. But very, very often you quickly realize how insignificant your actions are in the context of the entire system. You realize, as I described, that actually the shift in diet isn't decarbonizing agriculture. It's actually just creating new markets, and then your feelings of hopelessness maybe come back even stronger. And so, you know, I think one of the things that I've started saying to people is, you know, I don't think that there's necessarily a silver bullet to get rid of those feelings, you know, in the context of this crisis. But the best thing we can do is organize kind of collectively. And, you know, if there's one behavior change I would recommend of people, it's get politically organized. It's, you know, in your community, for your trade union, through a political party, through a grassroots movement, begin organizing for a socialist Green New Deal. That won't cure any feelings of hopelessness or lack of control that you have like entirely, but through the bonds of kind of comradeship that you develop, through the kind of shared struggle towards, you know, something better, that's as good as anything, you know, both in terms of it being effective politically as well as more personally in actually kind of helping us deal with maybe the feelings that bring people towards this real need to change your behavior sometimes.
Yeah, leading on from that point, I mean, last year we saw Extinction Rebellion bring London to a halt, and the Labour Party calling for a national climate emergency. I wonder how we organise around the Green New Deal in the context of COVID-19, where we can't do the kind of direct action or protest that we'd seen from XR and the kind of in-person organising we'd seen from groups like Labour for a Green New Deal.
Yeah, well, I'll, you know, defer to Chris on most of this, because he's the one who's kind of been organising and doing so well, organising so much of the response to this in the Labour Party. And obviously, you know, it was a huge victory to get that motion through Labour conference last year that committed the party to so much of what we wanted out of the Green New Deal. And really, I think the fight now, the fight within the Labour Party, so the electoral battle, is about putting enough pressure on the leadership to make sure that that pledge is maintained, that 2030 pledge is maintained, and the kind of conditions that were imposed within that motion are maintained. And so that requires getting involved in CLPs and making sure that when conference starts happening again, which, you know, may not be until next year, maybe the year after, that motions are going forward to just, you know, impress the importance of this to the membership, because, you know, it is such a popular policy. It's popular across the political spectrum. It's popular in society as a whole, and it just really makes sense to have this as a central pledge for a Labour government. And there is obviously a lot of concern that there will be backtracking on this under a Starmer leadership. So there's that electorally. And obviously, you know, I think we have all learned over the last 5 years that we cannot simply focus on electoral politics, and that we do need to be thinking more about direct action and about other forms of campaigning and mobilising and organising people. So there's obviously, you know, other areas of the state that can be the subject of radical demands for change. So local government, for example, innovations like community wealth building and the Preston model, which seek to build, are really, really important, I think, especially if we're thinking about, you know, a Green New Deal that is going to be decentralised as well as central. Obviously, direct action, protests, things that shine a light on the issue are really, really important. I think so much of the reason that there was so much success on the Green New Deal within the Labour Party was because of all the protests that were going on elsewhere in the country. Now, obviously, there are questions there about tactics, about how you're getting people on side, but I think broadly speaking, there is a strong case for direct action to tackle climate breakdown. And I think there's also you know, often very targeted campaigns can be very effective as well. So the one that always comes to mind is when Momentum organised protests outside lots of bank branches of the banks that were funding fossil fuels companies. Things like that have a clear aim and a clear target can also, I think, be really, really effective. And we obviously need to be kind of relying on organisations like Momentum, like Labour for a Green New Deal, to try and kind of mobilise people to get behind those actions.
Yeah, absolutely, all of that. I guess quickly on the point of how are we doing this in the kind of COVID context, I think actually what we're seeing is that people, whatever area they're organising we're in, are innovating how to do that very well. You know, as my understanding is that Extinction Rebellion will be doing another of their kind of big rebellions in September. So I'll be really interested to see how they pull that off, how it's different, if at all. And then in the context of Labour stuff as well, I think it's been. I'm also a co-chair of a CLP, of a district party. So I've been incredibly frustrated that as a party we've not been able to meet and exercise, you know, our democratic processes. We've not been able to pass motions and stuff over the past few months, really since about March time. But again, that wasn't because of any essential limitations of lockdown. That was something that was imposed from the top. So, you know, I think what we have to be mindful of is, you know, when we're organising within, you know, whether it's bureaucracies, whether it's in big organisations like the Labour Party, you know, sometimes there will be the possibility of organising. You know, we've been hosting Zoom meetings and stuff, but we've not been able to pass motions and hold the leadership to account on the very many policy changes and other developments that have happened. So that will have to be a consideration. But what we're now seeing is a reopening up of that democracy. Obviously, as Grace said, conference isn't happening this year. That's another thing I'm kind of annoyed about. But I think we have to be adaptive. You know, whenever we were successful in the last 18 months or so, moving towards conference last year, you know, we weren't working through a perfect internal Labour Party democracy. We were making the most of it. We were pushing it to its limits. We were having an external kind of communication strategy. We were really creating the conditions for the leadership to lean into those ideas that we were putting forward. And we need to do the same. And, you know, Grace is right. It's going to be, you know, immeasurably hard to do that under the current leadership. It's really clear to me that Starmer's leadership at the moment isn't taking its lead from the left, like, basically at all. And so I think we need to be thinking, you know, how do we develop strategies of organising within the Labour Party to, you know, create those conditions, put pressure on the leadership to not just maintain the kind of positions that we won in 2019, but to advance them and to take them further and to update them so that they're relevant and appropriate, and, you know, they face up to the challenges that, you know, we're now seeing with the COVID pandemic thrown into the mix. You know, climate crisis will only intensify at, you know, seemingly at close to exponential rate over the next few years. So it shouldn't just be about defensive measures, we also need to be really forcing the party to go further. And just, Grace is also right to say that we shouldn't just be focusing on electoralism, because I think we've seen many examples throughout recent and longer history that simply occupying state power, doesn't mean that you have power in the broader sense. And so I think one of the things that I'm really interested in seeing develop is, we need a kind of, to rebuild the power, the confidence of the trade union movement. We need the trade union movement to be militant, both in defending workers' rights and workers' interests, but also in really advancing the structural transformations of the Green New Deal. I think one of the things that's great about the Green New Deal as a framework that sets it apart from kind of previous iterations of climate politics and environmental movements is it does really prioritize workers' justice and class politics. And, for me, a successful Green New Deal has to be led by organized workers. It certainly won't be successful if it's opposed by them. But it has to be led by it, because what we're talking about is a transformation of the economy, essentially. So, to empower working class people, working class communities, in the broader sense. And so, but we have in this country and in other countries a trade union movement that has been subject to decades of assault and defeat by successive neoliberal governments. And so it's a massive, massive project to rebuild the unions in membership and, as I say, power and militancy. But ultimately, the workplace is still a massive site of struggle and power that from which the working class can leverage its power, and in the fight for a Green New Deal to transform the economy. We want to be bringing large swathes of the economy into public ownership, and if you have workers in those industries, those key industries, whether it's energy, transport, manufacturing, agriculture, taking industrial action in support of those transformations, I think that's going to be a massively significant element of any strategy, and potentially more important than an electoral strategy at this point. Who's to say? I think they interlink massively importantly. You can't really have one be successful without the other.
Thank you, Chris. I've just looked at the time, and I'm aware that Grace might have to head off soon. So I think we're going to finish at 8. But I just would ask if both participants could sum up what the Green New Deal means in post-COVID, the post-COVID age, please, if that's okay, in 1 minute.
Yeah. So sorry, I had to leave at 8 on the dot. But yeah, I mean, your questions have all been fantastic, and you can always DM me if you really want to know my opinion on something.
And this will be on YouTube, so people can continue in the comments and things.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, for me, this is such an important moment in time, because we are dealing with the biggest economic crisis really in living memory. And the way that we respond to this, the way that we both directly respond to it right now, and also the way that we kind of rebuild the economy afterwards, will kind of determine what happens for many years to come. Just as we responded to the financial crisis in a way that deepened inequality and kind of hardened those pre-existing divisions in society, made our economy less sustainable. If we respond to this crisis in the same way, and I actually have an article out in Tribune today saying if we respond to this crisis in the same way as we did the last one, then we will experience an even deeper stagnation and malaise than the one that we've experienced over the last 10 years, which has been very deep and has left our economy very, very fragile. So we really have the opportunity to rebuild the economy in the wake of the pandemic in a way that is much more just, much more sustainable, much more equal, and which uses something along the lines of a Green New Deal, not just to get the economy back on track, to improve living standards, but also to make sure that stuff like this doesn't carry on happening, because we know that the pandemic is linked to climate breakdown, is linked to the degradation of all of our environmental systems. And if we want to live in a world that is not characterized by constant pandemics, by constant natural disasters, we need to start getting a grip on this now. And now is really the time for the Green New Deal. If it's ever going to happen, it's got to happen now.
Thank you, Grace.
I'll be as brief as possible. I think for me, entering in, there's no point having a socialist politics in the 21st century if it's not intimately bound with the climate crisis that we have to reckon with. Because quite frankly, we're already seeing the incredibly intense, devastating impacts of the climate crisis, climate injustices. How even if we stopped emitting fossil fuels tomorrow, we would still see those impacts intensify because of how the climate crisis is working. And so actually, as well as how, what the Green New Deal does is has the potential at least to marry the socialist transformations that we desperately need with the climate measures that we desperately need in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of adaptation. We need to figure out how to build socialism, continue building socialism in the context of an intensifying climate crisis. We need to, as well as mitigate the climate crisis, learn how to adapt in the broader sense. And for me, it's through a kind of socialist politics. It's through the framework of a Green New Deal that can be articulated. And it's through the kind of, the organizing that we've described, both electoral, militant trade unions, and in the grassroots and social movements, that we're going to see that be successful.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. Sorry we didn't get a chance to questions, everyone, but this will be up on YouTube, so we can continue the discussion there. And I'm sure if you Chris or Grace, they'll be happy to talk more about this. So I'd like to thank Chris and Grace for joining us this evening for this brilliant discussion. You can pick up Grace's book Stolen on the Repeater Books website from a link that I'll drop in the chat. And you can subscribe to Left Book Club by following the link posted for some brilliant books delivered to your door each month. Subscribe by tomorrow to receive a copy of Colin Ward's Anarchy in Action, and their next book that's coming up next month is The Global Police State by William Robinson. We'd like to thank all of you for coming, and I'd like to thank Breckner and the Left Book Club for hosting this with us. And finally, another big thanks and a round of applause for Chris and Grace. And have a wonderful sunny evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.